there are not many post-World War II aircraft that can look at a long and eventful combat career. Nor are there many that can call themselves an ace maker or soldier on from horrendous combat losses to keep on flying into the 21st century. Today's feature is the world's leading distributor of MiG parts, the F-4 Phantom II. First used in combat during the Second World War, it was nonetheless the Korean War that really secured the jet's aircraft position as the new king in the sky. With both the Soviet Union and the United States being locked in a standoff, the next generation of fighter jets were being drawn up. The F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15 might have duked it out over Pyongyang, but going forward, new, faster and more capable aircraft were needed. Naturally, the industry knew this and they wanted a slice of the pie. Around this time, the McDonnell Aircraft Company in St. Louis, Missouri was in a bit of a pickle. It had just lost a potential Navy contract for a new air superiority fighter. That contract went to Vought. Following this, the company found itself without a clear purpose. Realizing the predicament that they were in, they went on the offensive. Banging on the doors of the American Bureau of Aeronautics, they said they came up with a new idea and asked whether someone would please just let them in. Someone did, and McDonnell presented plans for a single-seat, large twin-jet engine aircraft with a heavy armament of 4 cannons and holding radar, designated AH. The Bureau didn't exactly jump at the idea, advising McDonnell that a more flexible machine was required, one that could be used as an all-weather general-purpose machine and able to carry missiles, bombs and even nukes. Nevertheless, 2 prototypes designed YAH were ordered, with McDonnell happy to make the appropriate modifications desired. It took 4 years for the first prototypes to take flight, now known as the XF-4H. The aircraft had changed substantially. New engines, no cannons, multiple missile hardpoints, a state-of-the-art fire control system, more powerful radar, and crucially, a second crew position to work all the new gizmos. About 24 pre-production aircraft were ordered by the US Navy, with new equipment being progressively worked into the actual design. In 1960, the first carrier trials were conducted on USS Independence. Following this, McDonnell finally got the official confirmation it was hoping for. The F-4H was selected to become part of the Navy's arsenal. In the next 3 years, the aircraft proliferated in the Marine Corps and the Air Force, a first for a carrier plane, and became known as the Phantom II, since a previous McDonnell aircraft had already used the same name. For the purposes of this video, however, I'll just call it the Phantom to make things easier. When entering service in America, an initial order of 192 planes was sent out in October 1960. It soon became apparent that the Phantom had the potential to become a new bestseller. McDonnell set out to break the majority of aviation records, in fact available in the Phantom's class, just for some extra publicity, and offered a very competitive support package to any purchase in an attempt to market the plane to all those friendly nations out there that had no upcoming replacement or that had budget concerns, which was pretty much all of them. Some of the takers were Australia, Egypt, Iran, Israel, Japan, Greece, South Korea, West Germany. The British too actually showed an interest, hoping to gain a replacement for the Royal Navy's Sea Vixen fighter and the Royal Air Force's Hunter. The Phantom promised to be both in one single package, and the promise of such a multi-role aircraft, and one that was fitting the budget, was simply too hard to pass up. The British honeymoon with the Phantom evaporated relatively quickly. For the accountants, the Phantom was a dream. But they had not reckoned with those annoying trifles that appear beyond the spreadsheet. Royal Navy carriers, for example, had relatively short decks. Too short, as it turned out, for the F-4. And they were also slower, giving less wind over deck, a problem for landing and takeoff. To overcome this, an extended front wheel, bigger flaps, drooped ailerons, and leading-edge slats on the tailplane were added. The nose was also modified so that it would actually fit on the smaller elevators on the British carriers. Except for the incompatibility between the US and the British fire control and navigational system, there was one final problem that caused a disproportionate amount of problems: the engines. Among the top decision makers were those opposed to having a foreign aircraft becoming the new standard Navy and Royal Air Force plane. No British jobs would be kept this way. As a compromise, the Rolls-Royce SPEY engine was chosen to power the new machine instead of the General Electric one from the US, making sure that while it might have come from the ex-colonies, it still flew British. The SPEY engine also promised superior performance, which made it a done deal. The problem was, it didn't fit. Ironically, after a redesign, the bulkier profile that allowed the fitting of the SPEY, now also redesigned to be cheaper but slightly less powerful, nullified any performance advantage. Around 300 aircraft were ordered, half for the Navy and half for the Air Force, but due to budget concerns, the order was cut savagely to a third of the original a little time later. But hey, at least 45% of the dollar value of the British order was produced on the home aisle. A later order of hand-me-down F-4 was actually following the Falklands War, yet those did in fact keep their General Electric engines because I guess they didn't want to bother with the SPEY once more. Turning back to the Americans, the Phantom would be used by the Navy, the Marine Corps and the Air Force. The 1967 merger of McDonnell Aircraft and the Douglas Aircraft Company had no real impact or influence on the aircraft's orders or on its design. Deployed initially to Vietnam as both a ground attacker and an interceptor, in this role the Phantom flew nearly 500,000 combat sorties, dropping ordnance in both high and low altitude bombing runs. It claimed around 170 victories, although a good number of these were in fact outdated MiG-17s and MiG-19s. At the same time, around 40 Phantoms were lost to the MiGs. While this puts the Phantom at a 3.5-to-1 ratio, a ratio disputed by the opposing side, by the way, around 450 of these aircraft were lost against SAM and AAA sites. This puts somewhat of a dent in the hopes of the US Navy and the Air Force that they had in the Phantom going into Vietnam, but it also must be seen in context. In the aerial engagements, the Phantom did well, although the lack of backup weaponry in the form of fixed guns, the limited rearward visibility of the aircraft, and the fragile hydraulics were negative features, paired of course with a lack of maneuverability against the MiGs. Part of this experience did prompt McDonnell to add guns to the aircraft, and it also added to the Navy's desire to establish the Top Gun school. Nevertheless, the loss ratio above Vietnam served as an early warning to the perilous nature of multi-role jets exposed not only to fighters, but SAM and AAA sites. Just like the Phantom might have been known as the leading distributor of MiG parts, so too might the Soviet-supplied AA devices be known as a consistent supplier of Phantom parts. In the Middle East, F-4s would be used by Israel, scoring a claimed 116 victories, and Iran. Iran, South Korea, Japan, Turkey and Greece continue to operate them to this very day. The Phantom was a twin-engine, supersonic, all-weather, multi-role jet aircraft. The aircraft's initial offensive weapons were air-to-air missiles with no onboard gun platform. This was back in the day when air-to-air missiles finally started to work, sort of. And everybody was swept away in the enthusiasm that Daka was no longer needed. It transpired that sometimes, even in a smart munitions world, the pilot had to nonetheless get medieval. So with the E-Type, the aircraft actually got a General Electric M61A1 Vulcan multi-barrel 20mm rotary cannon holding 640 rounds, enough ammo for around 6 seconds of fire. Additionally, 4 to 6 AM-7 or AM-6 Sidewinders could be carried. 16,000 pounds of conventional or nuclear ordnance could be carried as well as air-to-ground missiles such as Mavericks. Turning to the aircraft beside me then, this is what is known as the FGR.2, one of 118 used by the British. It has a length of 17.5 meters, a span of 11.7 or 8.4 when folded, and it stands at 4.9 meters. It is one of those Phantoms that actually use the SPEY engine. The FGR was specialized in ground attack and tactical reconnaissance, initially deployed to West Germany to provide some support in case the Cold War, well, ever heated up a bit. Before we jump inside, let's go over some of the design characteristics of this aircraft. It is crewed by a crew of 2, the pilot and the navigation and weapons systems officer. Going over the aircraft, we'll see the nose housing the radar system, the enlarged inlets for the SPEY engine, of course, and the swept wings. To cope with the airflow demands of the SPEY, small auxiliary intake doors were added for landing and takeoff purposes, one above and one below the main intake. The engine was rated at a maximum thrust of nearly 21,000 pounds, giving the plane a top speed of just over 2,200 kilometers an hour. Range was set at 2,800 kilometers or 1,600 for combat use, although again that could be extended with 3 external tanks. You might now wonder what advantage the SPEY ultimately yielded to the British Phantoms. Well, the 20% increase in thrust in maximum reheat gave it better initial acceleration. But the increased drag from the bigger inlets negated any clear advantage in the long run. While low-level acceleration was impressive over the Yankee model, the high-altitude performance also deteriorated faster. The initial design of the Phantom with wings swept at 45 degrees proved to have various aerodynamic and stability flaws. The main modification to combat this were the dogtooth notches on the leading edge and by changing the dihedral of the outer panels by 12 degrees. These panels could also be folded inward, as you can see, to assist storage. The Phantom has a recognizable tailplane with the horizontal stabilizers actually swept downwards. The electronic countermeasure pod is added to the top of the vertical fin. All in all, the aircraft presents itself as quite a compact yet streamlined package. For the weapon systems, as mentioned, the FGR was put into a strike role. The aircraft could nonetheless carry 4 Sparrows or Sidewinders. One of the design features was that the missiles were set in a housing partially exposed. This was a compromise of sorts between McDonnell and the Bureau of Aeronautics, with the former having provided external mountings, but the latter wanting internal ones. Like with America's Phantoms up to the E-type, a gun pod could be equipped. In this case, a 20mm cannon, 1,200 rounds provided 12 seconds of fire. Of course, beyond that, you had pylons for bombs, rockets, missiles, and even reconnaissance pods as well. But enough talking. Let's get inside. So, sitting in the Phantom, first impressions? Well, considering that this aircraft was sort of, I don't want to say competitor to the F-5 Tiger, but they sort of occupy the same time frame, obviously with the Phantom being a 2-man ship, whereas the Tiger only has 1. The Tiger is a lot more comfortable. Now, the Phantom isn't bad. I've got ample room, even for my size. This is perfectly fine. I can move everything, I can touch everything, and I don't feel cramped. But ironically somehow, for the aircraft that was actually introduced in the US Air Force and in the Navy, the Phantom, and the aircraft that was more or less used sort of as an export giveaway, the Tiger is a lot more comfortable. But this being an American aircraft, I still have plenty of room and everything is nicely visible. The layout is as you would expect it. Of course, this is a time when a lot of new systems are still being introduced, so you do see some changes going through the different generation of jet aircraft, but the general layout of a cockpit is always sort of going to follow the same sort of lines. To the left, for example, here we have a lot of the systems concerned with the engine starter, with the start of the machine and so on. We of course have our throttle control, we've got our keel control. Up front we have all the instruments required to actually operate the aircraft, fly it, the engine, how the engine is working up and so on and so forth, and of course the weapons avionics as well. And to the right then we have a whole array of, you know, switches and bits and bobs for radio communication and all that good stuff. So we'll go a little bit more in detail now, and I'll show you all about the inside of this aircraft and this pilot station right here. So starting then on the left hand side, as I said, a lot of systems for concerning the starting of the engines. You've got the master switches, you've got the engine starter switches just to the right here between the throttle controls and the seat. You've got the fuel system up top all the way to the left, and then of course we go to the throttle levers. One per each per engine, of course, so you push those forward and they will stop somewhere mid swivel. There you can then go into afterburner if you want to override the system. This is not possible at the moment in this museum piece, but you could push it all the way forward and essentially, you know, give yourself a nice little piece of thrust right there. Pulling it backwards, you will see a little bit of a friction control there that allows you to, you know, essentially personalize the aircraft a little bit and see how much friction and resistance you want to have with the throttle control. Moving along a little bit further, first of all, here we've got for the ejection seat, you can dial in your your poundage, really, your weight. Right here. Behind the dial for your weight, you have the drag chute lever that you could obviously pull to come to a more immediate stop on landing. And just to the right, just behind the throttles really, you've got this little joystick here as well. It's a little cube really. That is essentially the bomb handle control right there. Moving up a little bit further here, we've got, you know, the oxygen control, the oxygen system and so on, and we've got all the indicator for the gear as well as the gear lever. The gear lever also acts as a double essentially. First of all, just manual operation of the gear up and down, and then for emergency you can actually use that lever and just pull it out, and there you go, the aircraft will hopefully release its gear. Moving then on swiftly towards the front of the aircraft, the instrument dashboard right here. First of all, we have the stick, very basic layout. You've got your little buttons, your little control levers. We can only use the aileron control at the moment. There's no real elevator control locked in place there, but you know, it's ergonomic, it works fine, it feels right in my hand, no complaints there. It's very simple. Moving up top a little bit here, then we have the weapon and missile avionics over here, where you can switch between missiles and guns. You can have your missile status displayed here and so forth. So this is essentially where you're going to look if you're going to operate the weaponry, or if you're going to select your weaponry really. Obviously you would also be keeping an eye on the radar scope. Moving up top, all the way on the top left, we've got the clock, and then we've got the ground speed indicator. We've got the altitude in feet, and we've got the speed in knots right there. Moving on to the middle, we have a gyro up top and a compass, a beam compass down low. Another altitude altimeter right here. And we've got your variometer, essentially your climb and descent right there, with another artificial horizon below it. Below that you have the device switch between TACAN, ADF and nav computing, where you can essentially switch through the different devices that you have at your disposal. And all the way to the right then you have your engine control indicators, starting of course with the fuel content, with the RPMs per each engine, port and starboard. You have then the temperature of the engines and the pressure, the fuel flow between them. Below that you have the jet nozzle position that also indicates whether it's open or closed. Moving up top then you have the radar scope right here, set in a prominent position. There's no way to miss it. Just offset to the top left, this is a very standard sort of placement. You've got your angle of attack meter, and then we have the gun sight. Now the gun sight is currently reflecting something. It is not in fact the actual gun sight as it would have looked like in real life. It is in fact a light that is hung right above the gun sight, a couple of meters up. Just to the right of the reticle, you have 3 more dials right here. You are starting essentially with the low altitude warning repeater light and the missile selected repeater indicator light. So it would be over here. Moving on to the middle, we've got a seam lock repeater indicator light and the heat indicator light. And then to the right, we have an electronic return on your angle of attack. If you're doing some ground attack, well, the main instruments are down low. As you can see, we've got the bomb selector switches and we've got all the instruments that are really required to arm the bombs, to set the bombs, and then also to release them as you wish. Facing me to the right, next to my knee, we've got the warning system lighting, and then all the way from up front, essentially all the way back, we've got instruments for radio control, radio communication, and all that good stuff. All of this stuff has to do with essentially keeping in contact with your flight, with ground elements perhaps, with the fleet, and of course we're talking with Rio in the back, or as I would like to call them, Nigel. The Phantom had many nicknames: Rhino, Double Ugly, St. Louis Slugger, world's leading distributor of MiG parts, and my favorite, coined by West German Luftwaffe pilots, Eisenschwein, the Iron Pig. With it, McDonnell had developed an aircraft that, while becoming obsolescent, was a worthwhile attempt to create a capable multi-role aircraft that kept itself in the fight for longer than anyone could have reckoned. And the experience gathered in this American classic would serve the United States and its allies really well in designing the next generation multi-role aircraft. Thank you very much for joining us on today's episode, and I want to thank the Royal Air Force Museum here in London for letting us get close with their Phantom. If you want to sit in this very aircraft, just follow the link in the description below. That will take you to all the required information. As always, please also consider supporting the channel via Patreon and by sharing this video. And have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky. Just click on something.